It's a little bit odd to be here, primarily because we actually have the Belt and Road Summit on June 28th at the end of this month, which I'm all inviting you to. It's also a little bit odd in the sense that this is a non-profit. So as investors, it's like, well, what's the big deal here? Why are you presenting at an investor conference? And the real question here, if you want, the slides are all here, so you can take a photograph of this and download them. It's not really the slides that are important. So why would a non-profit be of interest to private investors? Well, if you're investing in cryptocurrencies or blockchain or anything involves one of these, you might want to think about how would you recognize if this, for example, was a Bitcoin wallet or one of these bucks which you heard this morning. If you're a corporation, how do you know that that QR code maps back to a corporation and not an individual employee? So the genesis of the Belt and Road Blockchain Consortium will go through. Specifically today, the focus is on our specific dimensions with respect to the Halal blockchain, which is a subchain of the main chain, but more importantly, the Islamic financial portion. So I'm actually not with sort of fintech, which I define as sort of have money, buy tech. I'm more on the tech fin side, which is have technology, may or may not need money. Globally, in order to finance climate risk and climate change, the UNEP inquiry, United Nations Environment Program, estimates about $90 trillion is going to be needed to upgrade plant. Now, not all of it cannot be borne by the private sector, by the public sector, so there's going to be a bit of a public sector, private sector mix. And with the advent of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, or the 1,600 different cryptocurrencies, we have a new method here. We have about 90 trillion in equivalent cooperation, and that's the one I would like to look at it. So today's the focus is on how you're going to raise $90 trillion in equivalent cooperation, and more importantly, how do you address some of the 1/3 of the economies along the Belt and Road that follow the Islamic faith. And the total addressable market of that is about 1 billion people. So here I'm really not talking about linear incremental improvement. I'm not talking about typical fintech, which is probably 15, 50, 80% improvement on existing processes. It's not the digitization of existing processes. I'm really talking about breakthrough tech, of which I consider Bitcoin as one. Now today I'm not talking about Bitcoin. I will not be talking about the BeSafe network, which is the research network. I'm talking about basically a standard about resolving QR codes to corporations and why that's necessary for the future of digitized trade along the Belt and Road. So as you know, we have something going on in finance. We've got these emergence of 1,600 different cryptocurrencies. You've got decentralized markets of about 11,000. Something's going on here, and it didn't happen sort of through traditional linear incremental. It happened through, in some sense, this blockchain innovation of which we're all benefiting. Now the Belt and Road, again, the Belt and Road Summit is at the end of this month. Again, you're all welcome to come to that. Most people conceive of that as hard infrastructure, building ports, railways, the traditional land route or sea route by land, sea, or air. There's one of them which is missing, which is what I'm trying to position Hong Kong for. And that is to help build the soft infrastructure for that, which basically means the data centers, the cloud infrastructures, all of that, all of those economies would need to have a online presence in order to offer the services they would like to do. So the question fundamentally is, how can Hong Kong play a role in that? How can Hong Kong help with the digitization of both trade finance, which again has been fundamentally changed. We can now track practically everything. You've heard about smart containers, smart sensors. You've heard about all these different inks that are used to go from packages. We're scaling down from containers to packages to packets, sort of that way down. So that's all going to be changing the way we think about that. So the vision of the consortium is provable sustainability. In other words, in order for you to trade along the Belt and Road blockchain at least, you'll be able to prove that your manufacturing, shipping, and other processes are sustainable. In other words, it's not just wrapping yourself in the green flag saying that you're environmentally stable. You have an immutable blockchain in a sense which you can then demonstrate it. Now this is going to be interesting because in some of the layer 2 technologies now we have with Bitcoin, you can now stream value like we stream music. And so we don't have to make all these massive capital upfront commitments. We can say, well, your financing is conditional upon certain performance, of which if you have signed sensor data, it's what I call KYM, know your machine, we can avoid what I call the fake data problem. In other words, how do you know that the data that you're being produced, that you're actioning, on for your algorithms actually can be attributed back to specifically a corporation. So this is a change in architecture, right? That's why we're not talking about linear incremental improvement. We're not talking about Kaizen. We're talking about breakthrough. And breakthrough tech is effectively very, very different because the changes of assumptions have changes in market structure approach and changes in the way we think about reasoning with a changing risk model. So the internet extended our eyes and mouth across the globe. Sorry, our ears and mouth. The internet extended our eyes with IoT and with these sensors now. Where even getting in your car, everything will be metered out. We're actually extending our hands and hearts, right? So 3D printing, when we're shipping the design from A to B, we're manufacturing, where we're pushing supply next to demand. Again, that changes what do you actually ship when you trade, when all you're doing is shipping a design to the country and then printing it out at the other end. So these protocols you'll hear, there's a blockchain or distributed ledger technology panel at the end of the day. The difference is with the internet, most of the value is captured at the top through these apps. You've had a lot of the focus there. With these cryptocurrencies and blockchain, most of the value captured is actually much lower down in the stack, right? The actual cryptocurrency itself. The efficiencies, the payment is the receipt. We're not matching payment with receipts anymore. Okay, the transfer, not copy model, which with digitization, you can always copy someone else's property. And last but not least, we don't trust anyone other than the correct implementation of the maths, which is why really it's an accounting innovation. We broke a lot of equations, right? The internet broke that distance equals cost. If you understood that, long distance phone calls was going to go away, telephony model is going to go away, you're going to move to a different model. What are the assumptions that are going to be broken by this change in architecture from centralized architectures to decentralized? Well, there's two of them, one of which is centralized is trusted, right? If you put everything in one place, put the firewall high enough, the moat wide enough, you could be secure. Well, time and time and time again, you have seen things get broken in. Therefore, again, the security model where there's no center to attack is a different one. More fundamentally for you who are in finance, the assumption here is time is money, right? We've kind of bred with that. And Bitcoin is an example for the very first time that we can see data equals money. In fact, to write into this data structure, it costs you $6,000 different dollars. The other assumption in terms of time is money is, in some sense, the assumption of interest, right? The assumption of riba, right? Now, for the last few years since the great financial crisis, when you have zero interest rate environment or negative interest rate environment, well, again, one can consider the challenge to that assumption, which makes the whole worldview on Islamic finance, which forbids the charging of interest, directly applicable to blockchain infrastructures. Why? Because you can't have an interest in a fixed token system. So the view in terms of provable sustainability and where you can packetize risk is what I would call the Isfalia view, specifically of interest because this is a Hong Kong initiative. Why? Because our rule of law here has a use-by date, right? Our rule of law and common law goes on to 2047. What happens after that? So the interest here is having companies who are wanting to do digitized trade along the Belt and Road do so via Hong Kong. Again, these are the basic innovations in terms of blockchain or distributed ledger technology. We don't know how to do scaling, which is one of the reasons why a group of volunteers, including myself, started scaling Bitcoin conference series. Value stack, I think, is known, optimization. So what we're really trying to do is leverage Hong Kong's rule of law and figure out what is the interface between the rule of law and all these cryptographic protocols. So rule of law, legal certainty, and cryptographic certainty. This is important because to get past corporate counsel, regardless of whatever technologies, how do you know who you're dealing with, right? How do you know your KYC? How do you know that that QR code maps back to that actual company? So we call that the BNS. So much like the domain name system, the DNS, that mapped, again, your domain name to an IP address, this effectively maps a corporate entity, a legal entity, to effectively a representation of a wallet. So this is the basic architecture. Again, it's public governance for private business. The Belt and Road blockchain is actually a non-profit. It basically registers change in state of legal liability, and it does so immutably. So it mimics in many ways all the changes of documents. You want to have a chain of effectively its evidence of I gave you this, did you accept this, and changes of state of when you hand off a good or manufacturing a product, a component from one supplier to the next thing down the line, because the other direction is basically what flow. Revenue is what flows. So money flows, goods flow one way, money flows the other. Because now we can stream money or value like we stream music, we can granularize and we can completely change the risk model associated with trade, which previously the identities of the counterparties of trade were identified by banks, right? You didn't know who you were dealing with when you traded along the Belt and Road, but you had a correspondent bank, and the bank knew the customer, and you assumed that they did their KYC. So effectively, on the Belt and Road blockchain, we deal with company registries. Why? Because companies cannot be anonymous, right? A company needs to be registered in a certain jurisdiction to have accessible, in some sense, the rule of law, some degree of legal certainty, but you need to know that state of that company in real time. So not only was it incorporated in a certain country, but whether or not that company is still not only verified but also valid. For example, was there a change in the board of directors this morning or 5 minutes ago, for example, or alternatively, who is the ultimate beneficiary of the flows along that? So this is why we call it we have traditionally the LEI, the Legal Entity Identifier system, which you're probably aware of in the Western world. But the important thing is that basically we're like an octopus for ID. So can we verify and validate a company as quickly as we can verify sort of the octopus card, right? But it's not payment. We do not involve individual transactions. This blockchain basically resolves a corporate entity to a wallet, and this is an identity wallet. Within that wallet, you can hold whatever other representations of your blockchain wallet, be it the Halal blockchain, Bitcoin, what have you. The initial question that we had was how can a company own Bitcoin? Right? You individually can own Bitcoin. More importantly, because the Belt and Road touches as far away as Kenya, what is the vision of the company, right? So we have the vision of the company is the phone is the company. If you have a phone as the company, if you're willing to provide some biometrics, you will be able to access and provide some degree of certainty for doing, for example, online trade. So the one I want to focus on today is specifically the Halal blockchain. Halal, as you know, is a process by which you have to effectively stamp or qualify a certain production process, be it goods from farm to fork, for example. If it's naturally, then it's halal. If it's not, it's haram. Total addressable market is 1 billion people worldwide. And again, we have to go back, because who ultimately is accountable when something goes wrong, right, in the production process, or the airbag, or whatever you want to, many of which will be made in China? Who is accountable? So you have to ultimately go back to this, the BNS, the mapping between the participants, in fact the QR code in this case, to the company who is involved with that. If you can do that company to QR code resolution, very much like the DNS, then you have at least something. But the problem that we solved is what happens if you make a fat finger mistake, a fat finger trade on an immutable blockchain, right? It's there, it's immutable, it's there forever. Right, so even the data, unless it's like Bitcoin, which is internally consistent, the minute you start relying on an external data source for a smart contract or an oracle, then you're relying on the veracity and validity of that data. But what happens if it's wrong? Well, you're going to get into what I would call an identity dispute, just like a domain name dispute. It was you. It was your machine that signed that. It was your sensor, that thing. Well, then how do you know that? Well, the blockchain says so. Well, what happens if the IoT blockchain, the data is wrong? So we envisioned a world that the blockchain itself is not necessarily an accounting innovation, it's actually a legal one, because we recognize the change in state in legal responsibility. All the blockchain does in this case is it lowers the cost of establishing fact. What happened, when, and who, and that's it. This is a one-trick pony. This is all it does. It's not the full solution, but it does something very, very interesting. It externalizes the cost of KYC, because the cost of joining the consortium is the cost of you validating to everyone else as part of the consortium that you are who you claim you are. And that's going to be very interesting and essential in some sense along the Belt and Road. So in some sense, this is the missing link, right? You've got people who can do horizontal transactions, but how do you know the vertical integrity of both the corporation at the top of it, because we're dealing with corporations? More importantly is, what is the integrity of the process? You know, for example, if a company created a Bitcoin wallet and you transferred Bitcoin and then the person ran away because the person didn't actually authorize the creation of that wallet, how can you be sure that there's a vertical integrity within that? So we call that basically vertical hash chains instead of these horizontal hash chains, which are what we can normally conceive of as basically being a blockchain. So we think this is the missing link, and it's particularly important for this whole provenance, specifically for halal processes. Why? Because how do you know that, for example, now we can track cows, I think I heard earlier this morning, via satellite. All these costs are coming down, but how do you know the data is good? So in order to meet this financing requirement of $90 trillion of equivalent cooperation, we need to move to a different view of what actually money is. Instead of a debt-based money, which is what we, again, the assumption, and it is an assumption, of interest. Let's look at equity-based monies. In some sense, the Islamic financial world has much to learn from that. And the reason here is because, well, when you have a fixed token system, you have the inability to charge interest, okay? That's the fundamental observation here. Now that we can track farm to fork, if it just turns out that the carrot came from the earth here, we can track it by satellite, we can track all these smart labels, and it ends up in destination Y. If you could see the path of that good, and if it met your standard, be it religious or food standard, what have you, in this case, halal, then it's up to you to say whether or not it's halal or not. So this is very, very different. This is like changing from the telephony world of circuit switched, where we establish a pathway for a certain good and we pump as much product through that pathway, to the internet, which is like, however that thing got to you, you don't really care, as long as it met your standard. So this is a fundamental change in architecture, from sort of push-based architectures of supply chain to pull. This is very important because we have a billion Muslims. 1/3 of the Belt and Road economy are basically follow the Islamic faith. That's 24 different economies. And if they can be able to source their protein and others and also address their financial concerns, that'll be a very good example for the Belt and Road. So in closing, if you want to look through this and talk through later on, I can show you the various different asset-backed instruments that we can now simulate through smart contracts on the Halal blockchain. Why? Because fundamentally all of these are secured. They're collateral-backed because they're secured through encryption. So not only can you have a financial system with no interest because you have a fixed token system, you can now simulate many of the different kinds of contracts that are fundamental to trade finance and also Islamic finance. So Kafala and Ram and Wadia, that's all here. We can actually look through go through systematically the different kinds of contracts for Murabaha in terms of cost plus infrastructures. Again, that's a very relatively simple smart contract, which again, these smart contracts are the way we will gain the efficiencies by automating many of the processes. And I would argue that about 65% of the processes traditionally done by Islamic banking and the Islamic world can be simulated by a blockchain-based infrastructure. So that's a big deal because, again, we have many economies now who are looking at blockchain, the UAE, Malaysia, Indonesia, including London, in some sense, for green finance. Can we address and do something very different for a market that's large and complex, and simplify it through blockchain? So please, again, hear the references. I wrote an article for CoinDesk, where I serve on the board, and most of these resources are there. I would like to encourage you, please, to come to the Belt and Road Summit at the end of this month. Thank you very much.